Good evening and a very warm welcome to all of you. We have Mr. Vikram Raghavan with us today to talk about the making of India's Constitution, and I wish him a warm welcome. We also have Professor A.R. Venkatachalapati from the Madras Institute for Development Studies who has agreed to chair this session. A warm welcome to him as well. Before I hand over the mic to them, I'd like to, Professor Chalapati will be introducing the speaker as well and chair the session. And before I hand over the mic to Professor Chalapati, I would like to say a few words about the Roja Muthiah Library and the Endowment Lecture Series. The Roja Muthiah Research Library was set up in the year 1994 with the help of the University of Chicago. In 1994, the collection was bought from the family of late Roja Muthiah, who had collected about 100,000 items in the area of Tamil studies, a wide range of material like books, periodicals, journals, posters, invitations, FA-panel material, which was moved to Chennai in 1994. And it was institutionalized in the name of Roja Muthiah Library to honor late Roja Muthiah. And over a period, we have been expanding this collection, and we now have about 350,000 items in the collection. This is systematically done by microfilming, digitizing various collections in Tamil Nadu and from other places. The library also has been cataloging various Tamil collections from all over the world, not just from Tamil Nadu. For instance, we have cataloged books, 19th and 18th and 19th century material, the Tranquebar Mission Press material in Halle in Germany. We have cataloged books in the Bodleian Library in England, the Tamil collection, and the Tamil collection in Cambridge University, and a few universities in the US, and several collections, number of collections in Tamil Nadu. The library also houses a number of collections like the personal collection of Professor Champaka Lakshmi, Dr. Airavata Mahadevan, Milton Singer, A.K. Ramanujan, Lloyd and Susan Rudolph. I have to share with you the sad news which we received just a few hours ago. The sad demise of Dr. Lloyd Rudolph. He's not with us today. So the collection has been expanding, and we have been digitizing this collection and making this collection accessible to scholars from all over the world. Now, a few words about the endowment lecture. Professor Mu Anandakrishnan, who obtained his PhD in civil engineering in 1960 from the University of Minnesota, USA. He served as professor of civil engineering at IIT Kanpur between 63 and 74. He served the United Nations in the UN Center for Science and Technology for Development, then as the Vice Chancellor of Anna University, and as Vice Chairman of the Tamil Nadu State Council for Higher Education from 1996 to 2002. Currently, he is the Chairman, Board of Governors, Indian Institute of Technology, Kanpur, and Rajasthan. He is the President of Ranganathan Center for Information Studies in Chennai. He is also the President of Tamil Nadu Academy of Sciences, Chennai. He is a member, Board of Management, NUEPA, Delhi. He is a member, High Power Committee on Renovation of Rejuvenation of Higher Education in India, and Chairman, Executive Council, Science City. He was also the chairman of Madras Institute of Development Studies briefly between 2003 and 2008. He has served as chairman of member of several high-level committees of the Ministry of Human Resource Development, UGC, NAAC, and so on. His honors and awards include Padma Shri from the President of India in 2002, the Order of Scientific Merit from the President of Brazil 1996, then the Distinguished Leadership Award of University of Minnesota, Honorary Fellow of the Indian Society for Technical Education, and so on. So Professor Ananda Krishnan, we are very happy that he is one of the trustees of the Roja Muthiah Research Library Trust, and he graciously endowed for this lecture series, as we have been having a lecture every month. So I would like to thank him. Today, he's been traveling, he's not able to come. Now I do not want to hold on to the mic. May I request Professor Chalapathy to take over from.
Vanakkam. Thanks, Sundar. It is not the convention to have a chair in the meetings organized at the Roja Muthiah Research Library. So my presence is completely superfluous, but I have been asked to do it. I'm kind of what can you say, like a make weight. Oppuku Chapani, my role. I came here basically because Vikram Raghavan is such a fantastic speaker. He's a kind of a live wire. And of course, the topic is also of great interest. See, the crowd that is here is basically, he drew this crowd. And if anything, probably seeing my name, some people might not have come. So he has drawn this crowd. The topic is, something of great interest to all of us. Granville Austin's great work on the Constitution of India. These two very important volumes, both the Indian Constitution, the cornerstone of a nation, and working a democratic constitution, the Indian experience. Just to give you an indication of, the importance of this text. When some years ago, the National Translation Mission decided to translate knowledge texts from something like 15 or 17 disciplines, 5 books from each discipline. The first book that was chosen from political science was this book. So Granville Austin died barely a year and a half ago, and many of you would have read Vikram Raghavan's very fine tribute to him in the EPW. Vikram Raghavan, the note has already been circulated to you, but let me just briefly introduce Vikram. Vikram studied, he did his schooling in Chennai. Then he went to National Law School, University of India in Bangalore. Then did international law in New York University. Briefly, he also worked with Neelan Tirichelvan, I think. He writes a blog. He writes occasionally in EPW and other journals. He has also published 2 books, one a joint volume with Sunil Kilnani and Arun Thiruvengadam called Comparative Constitutionalism in South Asia. I came to know of him because he's such an enthusiastic scholar. He makes the effort to go and see people, talk to them. And so that's how I have been in touch with him. So I'm like you, I am also very eagerly looking forward to his talk. Vikram.
Like to use some other lights? You can't see? That's okay. You can see this. You want to see me? Okay, sir. My public speaking teacher, so I don't want to cross the lines. So, thank you very much, Chalapathy, for that very generous introduction, which I don't think I deserve. You are one of the people who have taught me to think critically of history. You and Arun Thiruvengadam, who you mentioned, have, well, not so much you, but Arun is sort of my constant critic. I'm not a scholar. I'm actually what Justice Krishna Iyer would call a pedestrian practitioner of law. And what I'm about to talk about is not particularly scholarly. It's really based on sort of a friendship, but also sort of an acquaintance more rather. It's not a solid friendship, but a more than decade sort of knowing Granville Austin. So it's from that vantage point rather than any scholarly pretensions that basically I approached this topic. But I must also thank Sundar. You don't know me and you took a gamble by inviting me at the urgings of both of your friends, the great Dharan, one of our country's great diplomats, who is a poet and presently Minister for Culture in the Indian Embassy in Washington, Dharan courageously invited me to speak at the embassy for Constitution Day. And I didn't make any great faux pas, so he therefore recommended me because I was competing there with a Carnatic music concert. And clearly, that was hard to do. And I think that I'm grateful that you sort of chose to have me speak here, especially in front of my own high school history teacher, my public speaking teacher, and it gives me great pleasure. I've spoken all over the world, but never really in my hometown. With that introduction, I just thought, you can hear me back at the back, right? Okay. I want to begin by talking about this book. We think in India that we know our constitution, but actually it's quite striking how little we are sometimes acquainted, even within the legal community. It is the actual text you see before you, which interestingly sold in an auction over the weekend for $3,000, is the Nandalal Bose calligraphed version. It's preserved by the Library of Congress in its rare book section. I thought it's apropos to mention this, given we are in such an interesting archival center, as one of the world treasures in books. And this is not a particularly old book, but yet they've chosen to preserve it and digitize it. So you can actually download this entire book in all its glory from the Library of Congress's website. It is also the world's longest written constitution. Here is the pocket version. It doesn't really fit into anyone's pocket, but it is more than 450 articles long with 15 schedules, and its total length is over 146,000 words. As the Prime Minister said in his speech last month, this is our Republic's only holy book. And I agree with that statement, even though I know there are lots of people who violently sort of dispute that characterization, because in a sense, we do profess a constitutional faith. And to the extent that we are citizens of a republic that practices this faith, this is the only holy book. Nothing else, in a way, can claim that status. But let's talk a little bit about this book first, before we get into our subject, because I think it's integral to understand Austin through this book. The Constitution, as many of you know, was adopted by the Constituent Assembly. It was a grand body that sat, grand in the sense of, in terms of the building and the sort of background in which it convened, of more than 400 men and women. And it was a big tent of people who came from many different backgrounds. The Assembly met in what is now called the Central Hall of Parliament. It used to be called the Council House. And it basically convened for almost 3 years in this room to debate and frame the Constitution. Some of the members of the Constituent Assembly were familiar faces from Indian nationalist politics. Others were not. Many were lawyers. Some were political organizers and activists. Some diplomats or to-be diplomats, mayors, many communists, and one Olympian. We also had one Jesuit priest, Father Jerome D'Souza, who basically hailed from the city, at least adopted the city for a large part of his life. Many members of the assembly were Gandhians, who had remained in the party and fought in the freedom struggle. But quite a few were not. They had never been a Forana member of the Congress or had wandered away like K.M. Munshi from its fold. But it was this gathering that really constituted a great team of rivals that drafted the Constitution. In understanding the founders, call these people who drafted our Constitution the founders in sort of the American sense, but in understanding their choices, their dilemmas, and their debates, there is no greater scholar, as Chalapathy has informed you, than Granville Austin. He is the Constitution's biographer, the Boswell of the Republic, and the interpreter of this constitutional faith that I just described. He was quoted by the Prime Minister in his two speeches on the occasion of Constitution Day in both the Lok Sabha and the Rajya Sabha. But his appeal is truly bipartisan. You will be struck to see how many people referred to him in the course of that discussion, but also in popular discourse. So who was he, and why did he spend so many years researching and writing about the Constitution? And as I've said, I've spent a few years myself trying to understand this man's life and work, which I want to share with you today. Austin, so let's begin, I suppose, at the beginning. And Austin was born in actually Boston, but in April 1927. But he grew up in a small town in Vermont, just above Massachusetts, called Norwich. The town was small, and everyone really knew each other, and it was in existence like Malgudi, without sort of stretching that metaphor too much, because it was sort of like Swami and his friends. Austin had a band of buddies who basically were his early acquaintances in this town. Now, growing up during the Depression, these boys had a austere but sheltered life. Their indulgences were milkshakes at the village store and skiing during the long winters of the American Northeast. When Austin graduated from high school, he went to nearby Dartmouth College, which was across the river in New Hampshire from Norwich. He graduates from Dartmouth in 1950. That, as we all know, was the year that the Constituent Assembly finished its work and our Constitution was finally adopted. Now, it's unclear whether Austin was even aware of this development when he was just out of college, because he does not appear to have been particularly interested in India at this point. But his first port of calling, though, he, like many Americans, wanted to see the world, and his first port of calling was Europe. So he joined the United States Information Service to, as he put it later in an interview, to make a name for himself. As part of the USIS, Austin served in Vietnam, both North and South. He was then posted to Lebanon. And it's really in Saigon and in Beirut, he makes his first Indian friends, including Indians who served in the UN Commission in Vietnam. And in Beirut, he befriends the embassy's minister, who was sort of concurrently accredited to the embassy in Cairo. As this sort of his early life unfolds, he sort of makes his big decision to marry Nancy Austin in Paris in 1954. She became his best friend, confidant, and more importantly, his project manager for the rest of his life, because he was the intellectual, right? Even though she, in a way, was his big critic and, could keep up with him in terms of his learning and reading, even though she never went on to get a PhD. But Austin grew more interested in foreign affairs as he spent time in the USIS, and it struck him that if he wanted to really understand the world, he needed to study history. Now, I do have to pause here and to say that this decision that Austin took was not quite unlike a lot of the others of his generation, including the Rudolphs who Chandra just spoke about a few minutes ago. They were people who were in the vanguard of the so-called emerging field of area studies, which I think everyone admits was the American government's attempt to really sort of counter the Russian launch of Sputnik, and therefore the US Congress financed large centers in universities and funded a lot of PhD programs devoted to understudied countries or regions of the world. And Austin was part of this tradition, as were the Rudolphs, as well as others like George Gadbois, who studied the Supreme Court. Now, unlike these others who I just mentioned, though, Austin decided that he needed not an American education but a British education, and so he enrolled to study Indian history in Oxford, where at St. Anthony's College he adopted two mentors, Cuthbert Davis, C.C. Davies, and Francis Carnell. Now, Carnell, who was a lecturer at the Commonwealth Institute at St. Anthony's College, was particularly interested in East Asia, having worked on the Malayan Constitution in the early 50s. And Carnell sent his students around the world to study governance in the newly decolonized countries, both in the Commonwealth and outside. And Austin signed up to do his PhD under Carnell and was assigned to study a fairly understudied area, which was the making of India's constitution, or India's sort of constitutional framework, because it was quite appealing to Carnell because it was, a fairly unstudied terrain. Now, Austin arrives in India in August 1960, this is sort of late Nehruvian Delhi, he admits to only a reader's knowledge of the country, yet he sets upon changing this sort of reader's knowledge of the country. The very minute he arrives, he travels like an intrepid explorer of his time with his portable Olivetti and keeps a diary from the very night he arrives. 50 years later, his notes and letters remain peerless and entertaining. They reveal a most curious mind, a talented writer, and a restless traveler. Among other things, these letters include fascinating insights on life in late Nehruvian Delhi. Every morning, Austin awoke to brown and musty bed tea. He had an English breakfast and read The Statesman before venturing out reluctantly into the oppressive heat to do what he had come to do, which was to undertake his research on framing the Constitution. Now, in terms of access to material, Austin's materials were these books. This is one volume of 11, which are the Constituent Assembly debates. But these documents, as is increasingly realized, are not an authoritative guide to understanding our Constitution or the founding choices of our republic. That is because these documents, these volumes, these debates are really three readings of the draft Constitution. They don't really tell you much about the political trade-offs or the big decisions that were made, because they were made outside the floor of the Assembly. So studying them is not hardly adequate, especially if you're doing a PhD program on the Constitution of India. And obviously, Austin quickly realizes this. And so, even though in the American tradition, our debates are likened to the American Federalist Papers, they are in fact just a verbatim transcript of the Assembly's proceedings, which were very choreographed. They do not shed light on the real discussions, and why were the articles, a specific article, drafted a certain way? Why did the founders choose this option rather than that option? For this, to understand these choices, one has to dig deeper into the files, the minutes, the committee reports of groups that met offline or away from the Assembly chamber. And if a scholar with Austin's ambition landed in Delhi today, they would go straight to the Nehru Memorial Museum and Library, at Teen Murti, and they can probably accomplish most of their research at the Nehru Memorial Museum's manuscript room, section, which holds the personal papers of virtually all the founders, with the exception of Ambedkar. However, when Austin began Cornerstone, the library and its manuscript collection did not obviously exist because Nehru still lived in the building. And so Austin had to look elsewhere, and he goes to the National Archives, where he fills out the forms duly. And he basically finds a lot of catalogs and lists. But in true sort of Sarkari tradition, these files are not made available to him because he was confronted with the best of Babudam. I'm sorry, I don't know where those papers are. No, those papers are confidential. We don't have these papers. Someone else is using them. And this tremendously frustrates Austin because he knows they exist. These are all, the rich and thick files of the choices made outside the floor of the Assembly, which in a way reveal the inner workings of the Constituent Assembly. So in great despair, Austin turns to other American and British scholars, and there were quite a few who worked in disparate fields, political science, sociology, and anthropology, who were in Delhi at this time. And there, although their academic training and agendas varied, they shared this sort of broadly common purpose of understanding Indian democracy and development. And this group of scholars basically gave Austin some leads about who to meet and where one might find these materials, since he was stymied in terms of official access to them. One of these scholars, Stanley Kochenik, who would later write an account of the Congress Party, told Austin, or actually gave Austin a great idea. He said, if you can't actually find the Constituent Assembly's background files or documents, or if you're not being given access to them, perhaps you can find the people who generated them. Because many of them, other than Ambedkar and Naladi, who were members of the drafting committee, were still alive. This is 1960 Delhi, only 10 years after the founding. And so Austin decides to do just that, and he makes a list from the who's who of who's who in Delhi he needs to consult. And one by one, he calls up people. introducing himself and saying, I want to come to interview you about your role in the founding of, in the making of the Constitution. Now, of course, his Oxford connections help, and so one by one, people across Delhi open up to him. Indians, that generation of Indians especially, seemed beguiled by this handsome red-haired New Englander. He was polite and spoke with a clear American accent, but he cleverly tempered it with some very impressive British-sounding inflections. And so no one seemed, this is Granville Austin, and so no one seems to have declined a meeting with him on this account. And he later wondered whether an Indian in his position would have enjoyed such extraordinary access. But be that as it may, one of the people who Austin interviews rather early into his project is Pandit Hridaynath Kunzru. You see him to the extreme left at this tea party, which Patel hosts in 1949 for the members of the Assembly. A decade later, he invites Austin to tea, or rather Austin invites himself to tea. It's unclear. And the interview notes of this meeting between Austin and Kunzru are fascinating. The first part of it, which is too big a file to show you in this one slide, but the first part of it, which is cut off, vividly describes what Austin saw on the way to the meeting, which was the scene on Curzon Road in Delhi, the hawkers and peddlers on the road, the tongas that passed by, as he got to Kunzru's home. The second part is his subject's facial features, including the fact that he reminds me of the vertical sheathing on a Vermont barn, weathered and grey on the outside, but solid bright wood underneath. And then in the third paragraph, Austin discusses his background and political career before summarizing what Kunzru told him. Now, obviously, if you're doing a PhD thesis, the first and second part can't possibly be used, especially in the 60s. No dissertation committee would take likely to it. But so in a way, these Austinian gems are sort of, the unpublished letters that I've spent more time reading than anything else. But Austin's big break really comes as a researcher when he calls on President Rajendra Prasad. The sitting president takes a liking to him. He gets extraordinary access to the president. And in what comes as a big surprise to Austin himself, Prasad offers him his entire trove of Constituent Assembly papers. Now, this is a valuable find because Prasad was obviously the chairman of the Constituent Assembly, and in the Prasad papers were the Alladi papers, were the Munshi papers, and part of the Ambedkar papers. And so Austin recounts in a letter back this, coup, basically of, this find where he basically, Prasad calls him one night to Rashtrapati Bhavan. He gives him access to these papers. Austin takes them in a taxi full of these papers to be microfilmed. He keeps someone at the National Archives waiting because obviously there were no photocopying shops in Delhi at that time, and then safely returns them back to Rashtrapati Bhavan the next day before anyone notices them missing. Now, this, of course, again, is I think it's no scholar could possibly, land this kind of luck ordinarily. But in 1963, Austin decides that he needs to throw everything he has at this project and he needs to see what else he can find besides the Prasad collection. And so he returns to Delhi for a final round of research. This time, Nancy and his 4 children accompany him. He wanted to commit himself fully to the project while enjoying the sights and sounds of India, and so the family travels widely. But their stay in India was particularly eventful because Nehru dies shortly after they arrive. And so Austin joins thousands of mourners who march past the departed leader at Teen Murti, and his children watch the funeral procession go by on their parents' shoulders. He writes about this evocatively the day after the funeral, because the passing of Nehru shakes him to the core, because Nehru is sort of the unstated heart of the Austinian project of chronicling the founding of the Republic. Yet, in watching and this is a great piece which the Hindu recently republished, but in watching the chaos surrounding Nehru's death and then the confabulations that followed, but the smooth succession that, led to Shastri becoming Prime Minister, in a way reaffirmed Austin's faith in the Republic, but also in his own project in terms of chronicling these developments. And he concludes, and probably one of the early Western scholars to do so, that democracy in India is no fad, and that it does have some solid constitutional foundations which can withstand sort of stresses such as the passing of a leader who sort of dominates the landscape. Now, the other thing that basically Austin is struck, because both he and his family sort of experienced this, is the 1965 Indo-Pak War. Slit trenches are dug in Delhi and blackouts are enforced. But again, Austin is struck that unlike other new democracies which his friends, Cornell students were studying, the civilian control over the military was not disputed. 4 years into Austin's research, into the project, Austin returns to England, and where he, in the library of St. Anthony's College, writes up his thesis. Its short title is Tryst with Destiny, the over-borrowed phrase from Nehru's independence speech. And so thankfully he drops this as he gets an author's contract and rechristens it as Cornerstone. He skillfully obtains this contract for a grad student. It's quite impressive to convert a PhD thesis so quickly into a book. And the book is, this is a photo of the American edition. There is a British edition and then later an Indian edition. This is the Indian reprint, the 50th anniversary reprint, I think. But this book is a fascinating narrative, skillfully weaving together the debates in the Assembly's plenary sessions with the committee discussions and other behind-the-scenes confabulations that he obviously now was privy to because of the Prasad papers and other interviews that he had done. And Austin's reconstruction of these events is so compelling that it's sometimes difficult to imagine he wasn't himself present at the scene between 1946 and 1949. It's a book that tries to get into the minds of the founding fathers and mothers, just as it tries to attempt to discuss, sort of takes away, sort of the, attempts to create some distance from the whole drama that was unfolding. But, and so in that sense, it's a great narrative, right? I mean, it's something that, which is why, as Chalapathy mentions, it became a runaway success. And as my friend Arvind Ilangovan, who is a historian at Chicago, really puts Austin at the heart of the Indian nationalist narrative. But it is a mistake to assume that Cornerstone is a series of dialogues among our founders, because Austin really takes great pains to understand the trauma in which the Republic was born. Partition riots devastated many cities. Refugees packed overcrowded camps, including in Delhi, where the Assembly was meeting. There was insurrection and turmoil across the land. Yet the Assembly pressed on with its labors, which really sort of struck Austin as extraordinary. And Austin particularly recounts how the Assembly debates civil liberties, fundamental rights. Even as Delhi is burning, that week they discussed the freedoms, the fundamental freedoms, including the freedom of speech. The Assembly members need curfew passes to get into the building. Now, obviously, that colored, their impressions and the resulting debates. And as Austin later evocatively says, the fundamental rights were framed among the carnage of fundamental wrongs. Now, this trauma, though, emboldened the founders' excessive desire on Indian political unity. This is a meeting of the Congress Assembly Party, which was only the congressmen. Others could come, but it was the Congress caucus outside the Assembly. And really, through these deliberations, you see their attempt to really build a solid framework against what Nehru would call fissiparous tendencies, really because they thought it was important to have a glue that would bring together this large and diverse land of many communities, groups, and ethnicities. Austin particularly marveled at the Assembly's landmark decision to grant every Indian adult the right to vote. Ignoring many skeptics, as he puts it, the Indian founders took a big gamble. They had few precedents to guide them. After all, very few countries had fully enfranchised all their citizens in the late 1940s. Yet, as Austin remarks, Constituent Assembly members took a remarkable leap a leap in the dark. And in hindsight, as he later records or comments, this was a winning bet, because universal suffrage builds popular support and wins lasting legitimacy for the Constitution, which was very much in doubt when, the document was signed and basically unfurled. Despite Austin's American roots, or in spite of them, Austin emphasizes that the whole exercise of the making of the Constitution was Indian-led. There were no foreign consultants or advisors, as he, quite emphatically declares. At the same time, as Austin notes, Sir B.N. Rao, one of our Constitution's penmen, visited Washington, Ireland and England for consultations as part of a study tour he took in 1948. And he relayed back very practical advice he got from President Truman, from the President of Ireland, and from judges he met, including Justice Frankfurter, the great justice on the American Supreme Court, on how much liberty Indians should have under the new Constitution. And therefore, Rao's final draft, because Rao was doing the drafting while the members, including Ambedkar, were in a way settling the big principles, and Rao and sort of Ambedkar work as this tag team, but the final draft heavily borrows from English conventions, from the Irish Constitution in terms of directive principles, from the American Constitution in the Bill of Rights, as well as a broad separation of powers. And this sort of borrowing, which Ambedkar later says, there's nothing to be ashamed of course, has its critics, including K. Hanumantaya, who is a great member from the Mysore state, who complains, we wanted the music of the veena and sitar in our Constitution, and instead we got the music of an English band. But this was again part of the great narrative that Austin weaves together. Now, the book comes out in 1966. It gets one or two mixed reviews. It gets a sort of a review that's almost half its length by Upendra Bakshi in 1967, which wins himself, which makes Upendra Bakshi a assistant professor at Delhi University, just as it basically projects Austin into the Indian scholarly imagination. And at a very visceral level, Cornerstone is really a feel-good book. It shuns academic jargon, technical language, and it's cast in short, simple, and powerful sentences. This makes it especially popular among constitutional lawyers and judges because it saves them from having to wade through the stem winders in the Assembly's debates, right? I mean, some of them are, they go on and on and on. And so the Supreme Court quickly takes note of this new title, and it comes just as the judges are deciding one of their most important cases, the confrontation between Parliament and the court over the right to property. And in the Golaknath case, a narrow decision, Chief Justice Subba Rao, who then resigns to stand for the presidential election in 1967, in his majority opinion, 1967, cites Austin as the learned author. This is a man who's just got his PhD, and the book has been in print for a few weeks. But it sort of adorns the Subba Rao judgment in Golaknath, a very controversial judgment, which leads then to another 6 years of confrontation between the legislature and judiciary. One would have thought that Austin's citation by Golaknath would therefore cause controversy. But it doesn't really stop or hold back Austin. In the case that was brought by this man, or in his name, Keshavananda Bharati, Cornerstone, Austin's book, is so persuasive that 12 of the 13 judges, both the majority and the minority on the bench, refer to it in their opinions. And so through the 1970s, citations to Cornerstone sprout like green gram in the Supreme Court's decisions. The Indira Gandhi's case, Menaka Gandhi's case, the dissolution of assemblies case. The justices reach for Austin as a reliable guide to interpreting the Constitution in many difficult matters. Yet the book's influence was also being felt outside the legal community. Cornerstone pops up in a number of parliamentary speeches. Historians, anthropologists, social scientists began using it in studying modern India and its public institutions. And Austin is now prescribed reading for IAS officers, for those who are aspirants to take civil service exams. I mean, no other legal text can claim this sort of cult classic stature. And then Austin, as Chalapathy mentioned, Cornerstone gets translated into many languages. It is now available in Telugu, Punjabi and Marathi. The manuscripts are ready for Malayalam, Odia and Nepali. The Tamil and Hindi translations are under preparation, together with versions of Cornerstone in Assamese, Bengali, Bodo, Dogri, Gujarati, Kannada, Kashmiri, Konkani, Sanskrit, Santali, and Urdu. I don't think any legal text, I don't even know if the Constitution itself has been translated into many of these languages, or at least accessibly. Now, as Austin grew in name and fame, he went curiously missing. In the years immediately after Cornerstone's publication, no one quite knew where he was or how to find him. And for years, he was known as this, great mystery man, and Bakshi sort of, was quite caustic about it. We now know, though, he was rather busy. For as the court was deciding the Golaknath case, Austin joins a research bureau in the State Department, and here is a memo he drafts to President Lyndon Johnson on the Middle East. So he sort of discarded his garb of his robes of an Indian scholar, and he has taken on what he wanted to do, which is to become a foreign policy expert. He works a few years in the State Department. He then becomes an aide to an American cabinet secretary, the equivalent of a union minister here. He then works for a congressman. And in the mid-1970s, he takes time off from scholarship and government service to spend time, as he put it later, with his family. So during this time, he works for a foundation. He writes a few occasional papers on American public policy, domestic public policy. And at one point in the 70s, he even applies to a modeling agency with a headshot, which I don't have here, but as resume I have, where he says, among other things, I wrote a book on the Indian Constitution, thinking the modeling agency in New York would be very impressed by this. In the early 1980s, Austin is in a way kind of wandering, searching for his sort of calling, and is obsessed by his interest in Middle East, the Middle East peace process, and U.S.-Israeli relations. He even considers doing a book about it. Meanwhile, though, back in India, speculation is rising about what happened to Austin, right? I mean, it keeps bubbling, and lots of people want to know because people are reading him. The court is still citing him through the 80s, very frequently. One man is particularly perplexed by this whole mystery. His name is Sudarshan. Some of you may know. He's from Kolar Goldfields, but he studied in Oxford. He read Austin as a student and was very anxious to meet him and solve this mystery about where is Austin. So he asks every American passing through Delhi, where is Granville Austin? Where is Granville Austin? And finally, someone gives him an address. And so Sudarshan, who then worked for the Ford Foundation, on his very next trip to Washington, takes a taxi to this address, 131 11th Street Southeast. He knocks on the door. Nancy Austin opens the door, and Sudarshan excitedly asks her, where is Granville Austin? And she says, after she recovered from the shock of this stranger, she says he's in the next room. And if you can believe the whole story, the meeting lasts for 4 hours, and by the end of the night, the Austins and Sudarshan toast to Sudarshan's project, which he had created for Austin, which was to return to India and to write a sequel to this book. Because Sudarshan's guru apparently had told him that you need to complete the full circle, and so never leave anything sort of uncompleted. And in Sudarshan's mind at least, Austin had to come back and revisit the working of this Constitution, who he had so magnificently described, in terms of whose creation he had so magnificently described. Now, Austin returns a few weeks after this meeting. Sudarshan takes him around the country. He is surprised by how warmly he receives. At the Kerala High Court, he receives such embarrassing praise that it seems that he personally drafted the Constitution himself. So, what has happened is Cornerstone's deferred glow had finally caught up with him. He was sort of reaping this, the fame that had gradually built up. So, like his first project, Austin decides, if I have to review the working of this Constitution, I need to meet people involved with it. And so he makes a list, just as he made a list as a graduate student, writes down all the people he needs to meet. Politicians and political commentators, like the founders, readily oblige him when he seeks interviews. Judges and lawyers chat with him like they are talking to old friends. Austin makes the India International Center his home base. He is a regular at the bar and restaurant. He never ate or drank alone. If he was there unaccompanied, he would always help himself to a stranger's table. There's always someone interesting to meet or talk to at in this place. Austin's network therefore greatly widened as his social calendar also grew as a consequence. He attends lunches, dinners, cocktail parties where he's introduced to senior bureaucrats and leading journalists. They constitute Delhi's underground railroad through which Austin manages successfully to penetrate. Lots of people feed him lots of rubbish, but he also gets valuable insights and information which frankly are very hard to obtain in a dusty archive. He never misses a single opportunity to make new contacts. Even in a barber shop, he meets the Attorney General who was having a pedicure, and he introduced himself as Granville Austin and gets promptly invited to lunch the following Sunday. Every night while in India, Austin returns home, opens his ring and rule notebooks, and faithfully transcribes all he saw and heard that day, whom he met and what they told him. These are his interview notes of his meeting with S. Gopal, who lived in the city for many years. No scrap seems too trivial to chronicle. His miscellaneous entries are filled with tidbits, just as his interviews are filled with all kinds of substantive, weighty stuff about what was happening. So, obviously, with these notebooks grow to over 50 and, thousands, hundreds of thousands of pages of manuscripts and photocopies. And so, a few years into the project, Austin grows overwhelmed by his scale. He has accumulated many thick folders of notes, clippings, and photocopies, and assembling a manuscript from this mass seems a daunting task. His first grant runs out, a second grant also runs out. Austin is forced to take a temporary break from this project. He even considers abandoning it, but Nancy comes back and says, "You gave your bond, your word to Sudarshan to finish this book," and so he comes back to Delhi with fresh funding. There were more people to meet after all and more papers to find. And a good 12 years after Sudarshan comes calling, Austin finally delivers a sprawling manuscript to his editor. And the second book, Working a Democratic Constitution, the Indian Experience, comes out in 2000. In this book, which coincides with the 50th anniversary of the Republic, Austin describes the successive stages in India's modern evolution as a constitutional democracy. It begins where Cornerstone leaves off, Republic Day 1950, and Austin carefully reconstructs the important political and constitutional developments in the following 4 decades. According to Austin's second book, India's constitutional foundations have remained firm and secure. The country has obviously witnessed great political and constitutional crises, but many of these crises, Austin believes, are from political machinations rather than defects in the Constitution's basic design. To Austin, therefore, the Assembly's cornerstone, the cornerstone he talked about in the first book, was still sturdy, and the founders had done well and wisely for themselves. So, the second book, as I said, comes out as India is celebrating 50 years of as a republic. It gets him more adulation. Like Cornerstone, it gets more reviews. Upendra Bakshi returns with a second review of Austin, and he now says that Austin is so infallible in the legal community and the community, the larger intellectual community. He is now a saint with his own gospel. Now, he meant that not in a very flattering way, but there you have it. Now, one of the things that Austin talks about in the second book is really the emergency. And there's a line here which basically reads as, New Delhi in 1976 was not Berlin under Hitler. This leads to a torrent of criticism, including from Bakshi, who feels that this downplays the excesses of emergency. And this criticism greatly bothers Austin, because he really felt that he had tried, from the material which was available to him and the interviews, to reconstruct faithfully what happened in emergency. So he decides, this worries him so much that he decides he needs to write a third book. And so he writes to all those who he thinks could help them in most poetic terms, to Mr. Gujral, to Mr. Advani, to anyone he believes could help him write a third book. Because he feels that this book can't be described through interviews. He needs to see the inner files of the 42nd Amendment, which basically, mutilated the Constitution during emergency. And he feels he needs to write a solid book that would silence the critics of his second book. But this obviously doesn't go anywhere. We don't have the Right to Information Act at the time that he embarks on this adventure. And so Austin gets this brilliant Sarkari letter which says, "Dear Shri Granville Austin, the matter has been looked into, the records are still classified, and hence it's not possible to make the government files available." And so Austin basically gives up, dejected. Mr. Nariman tries to sort of work around this, but it doesn't really work. And so he decides to sort of retire, spend time with his grandchildren, and he quietly fades away. Now, I want to sort of conclude this narrative part and sort of move to my final part of my talk by recording what I think are the three great contributions of Austin, and there are many. And there are quite a few, obviously, critics of Austin. But Austin's greatest sort of achievement, in some sense, is to basically instigate in us an awareness and a quest for understanding the founding fathers and mothers. Austin credits an oligarchy comprising Nehru, Patel, Prasad, and Azad for the Assembly's successes in finalizing the Constitution. These were the heroes of the freedom movement, and therefore they commanded great political capital, which they used. At the same time, obviously, there is a big omission from this gang of four. Can you imagine writing a book today about the Constitution and not placing Ambedkar at the center of it? And it is not, though, in my view, that Austin wanted to basically downplay Ambedkar's role. In fact, he really tries to track down the Ambedkar papers more than any other papers, because he knows there are probably valuable things in there, and that he needs to tell a better account of Ambedkar's involvement. And by my own sort of rough estimate, he's one of the first scholars, because we're talking about the late 60s or mid 60s, who, beyond the relatively unknown biographies of Ambedkar, he's one of the first major scholars to recognize the role of Ambedkar in the Republic, even though we could critique the fact that he doesn't put Ambedkar in the middle of the drama, which he was, by all objective accounts. Now, this sort of, in a way, cherry-picking of who India's founders were, mostly upper caste men, North Indian upper caste men, obviously extends to the women. He said there were 9 women in the assembly, and he mentions Durga Bai Deshmukh, who lived in the city. But he ignores Hansa Mehta, the great Gujarati founder, who played a pivotal role. She is among those who helped draft the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And so there are these Austinian omissions. Father Jerome D'Souza doesn't really get any press in the book. But these are, again, sort of, we're looking at a graduate student's work from the 60s. Now, the second sort of contribution of Cornerstone, or Austin's contribution to our understanding of the Constitution, is really in creating a sense of drama about the founding. And Shyam Benegal, whose television series I ordinarily urge people across the country to see, but this audience, I think I would not make that a recommendation, especially since it's in Hindi. That's far higher for even me to comprehend. And I'm supposed to have studied the language. I understand there's going to be a subtitle version of it released. But this drama, which is chronicled through 10 episodes produced by the Rajya Sabha television, really, Austin serves as a screenplay for it. So our understanding of the drama of the founding is really an Austinian drama now set to a script and set to basically dramatized for television. This drama, though, entices readers who we never thought would read or consult the primary material. I can't tell you how many people come to me who are not lawyers or scholars wanting access to the Constituent Assembly debates. The last talk I did, the local IIT chapter wanted to know how they could upload this on their website. And I think in that sense, it's a great thing that people are reaching for founding debates to better understand basically the choices that India confronted when it became a republic. And as I mentioned earlier, these debates among the founders and the informal discussions that surrounded these debates at tea parties in Lodi Gardens, where Patel walked with a lot of members and sort of made big decisions, provide deep insights into the working of India's modern democratic institutions and our problems and challenges as a republic. Why did we choose a parliamentary rather than a presidential system? Read Austin. What role is assigned to religion in our secular state? Read Austin. How and why did the framers draw boundaries between the center and the state when they chose federalism as a basic feature of our Constitution. Read Austin. Why did this man, N. Gopal Swami Iyengar, put Article 370 into our Constitution? Again, Austin. Now, what does our Constitution say about equality, reservation, freedom of speech, minority rights, all the controversies we confront today? In a way, one of the keys is Austin. I'm not suggesting he is now the only. There are lots of new scholars actually, in a way, sort of following his footsteps, and in some cases, pointing out fundamental flaws he made and going beyond them. Finally, Fali Nariman, our great constitutional expert, calls Austin's book a testament of hope. And in fact, this, ironically, is one of his critics' most powerful objections, that he creates this great euphoria. It's a very romantic account of the founding, which we know was messy and doesn't have to be told in such a rosy way. But even though, and the other critiques of him suggest that Austin, while he chronicles in such great detail, in this rosy way, what actually happened, he does not venture to offer his own opinion, either on the choices that the founders made or how the Constitution was worked. And so that's really what led him to this whole emergency criticism, that he describes in such felicitous terms what happened, but doesn't actually sort of step back and analyze the developments. Now, I do think that, while I think that this criticism is somewhat is right, I do think it also misunderstands Austin and his projects, because firstly, he was very concerned that he would somehow misuse his privilege as a trusted interviewer, chronicler of these developments, and he was very, very conscious of the fact he was a foreigner and didn't want to be in the situation of judging. But above all, Austin's reticence was because at the core, he really remained a modest man with very modest opinions, and he probably would have been quite embarrassed that we are talking about him today. Thank you very much.